we read this morning, we read chapter 5, which is pretty long. But I'm rereading it because it messed up. So I've split my last video into two different parts for the chapters to make sure they were good. So this is actually going to be part 25 instead of part 24. So, and then tonight, maybe tonight, I'll think about tonight. I might just go right in. Not sure. So we are on part 4, chapter 5, part 1. Let me make sure that... Ooh. So, okay. I had to hiccups a little bit. Part 1. Tack sat on the north side of the rim, talons digging into the rotted hide of an old fallen tree. Now literally eagle-eyed, it had no trouble picking out the vehicles below. It could even see 2 people in the ATV. The rider behind the wheel, and next to him, the boy, the shit and prey boy. Here after all. Both of them were here after all. Tack had met the boy briefly in the boy's vision and had tried to divert him, frightened him, send him away before he could find that one that had summoned him. It hadn't been able to do it. My God is strong, the boy had said, and that was clearly true. It remained to be seen, however, if the boy's God was strong enough. The ATV stopped short of the yellow truck. The rider and the boy appeared to be talking. The boy's Dama started walking toward them, a rifle in one hand, then stopped as the open vehicle began moving forward again. Then they were together once more, all those who remain, joined again in spite of its efforts. Yet, all was not lost. The eagle's body wouldn't last long, an hour, 2 at the most. Right now, it was strong and hot and eager, a honed weapon which Tack grasped in the most intimate way. It ruffled the bird's wings and rose into the air as the Dama embraced the domain. It was losing its human language rapidly now, the eagle's small cantoi, brain incapable of holding it, and reverting back to the simple but powerful tongue of the unformed. You got something on my book? It turned, glided out over the well of darkness, which was the china pit, turned again, and spiraled down toward the black square of the drift. She got something on my book. Did you get spit on my book? It landed, uttering a single loud quack as its talons sorted the scree for a good grip. 30 yards down, the drift, pallid reddish pink, light glowed. Tack looked at this for a moment, letting the light of the antac fill and soothe the bird's primitive marvel of a brain, then hopped a short distance into the tunnel. Here was a little niche on the left side. The eagle worked its way into it and then stood quiet, wings tightly folded, waiting for all of them, but mostly for Prey Boy. It would rip Prey Boy's throat out with one of the golden eagle's powerful talons, his eyes with the other. Prey Boy would be dead before any of them knew what had happened, before the Osdam himself knew what had happened, or even realized he was dying blind. I just started reading and now they need out. Please excuse me, give me just a few minutes. Get something to drink, something to snack on, grab some tea, grab some coffee, whatever you need. I'll be back. 5 minutes. Okay, we're going. Okay, we're going. Outside. Come on, outside. There you go. Let's go. No, down. Good girl. Come. Come. Good girl. Oh, don't be barking at the dog. Oh, good Lord. Harley, get back outside. Baby, stop jumping. Baby! Now, so, yes, I'm coming. I'm coming. I had to get something. Stop jumping. Baby! That's off. 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 Ouch. No. No. Hey! Hey, that's mine! Harley! Harley! Baby! Harley, get down! What? Now, go! No, out here! Ouch! Outside, both of you! Ouch! No, go! Harley! Outside! What are you doing? What is with her right now? No, go! Sit on TV! Yes! Get outside! Nope, that was mine now. Yeah, she said, stop there. Say no more. Just stop. Jesus. Like, so, excuse me. Citizenship. Some do it out. Some pieces of share. It's up. But that's on air. To our ear. This is what she's out. You know, she's out. So See if I can find it. All right, I am back. My husband went on break, so I talked to him real quick too. So sorry for the long wait, but thank you for sticking with me. Part 2. Steve had brought a blanket, an old faded plaid thing, along to cover the boss's scoot with in the event to cover the boss's scoot with in the event that he did end up having to transport the Harley to the West Coast in the back of the truck. When Johnny and David pulled up in the ATV, Mary Jackson had this blanket wrapped around her shoulders like a tartan shawl. I love shawls. The truck's rear door had been run up, and she was sitting there with her feet on the bumper, holding the blanket together in front of her. In her other hand was one of the few remaining bottles of Jolt. She thought she had never tasted anything sweeter in her whole life. Her hair was plastered flat against her head in a sweaty helmet. Her eyes were huge. She was shivering in spite of the blanket and felt like a refugee in a TV news clip. Something about a fire or an earthquake. She watched Ralph give his son a fierce one-armed hug, the Ruger 44 in his other hand, actually lifting David up off his feet and then setting him back down again. Mary slid to the ground and staggered a little. The muscles of her legs were still trembling from her run. I ran for my life, she thought, and that's something I'll never be able to explain, not by talking, probably not even in a poem. How it is to run, not for a meal, or a medal, or a prize, or to catch trail. Put her hand on her arm. You okay? I'll be fine, she said. Give me 5 years and I'll be in the goddamn pink. Steve joined them. No sign of her, he said, meaning Ellen, Mary supposed. Then he went over to David in Marinville. David? All right? Yes, David said. So's Johnny. Steve looked at the man who had been hired to shepherd, his face noncommittal. That's so. I think so, Marinville said. He glanced at David. You tell him, Cabbage. You got the head on you. David smiled wanly at that. He had a change of heart. And if it was my mother you were looking for, the thing that was inside my mother, you can stop. She's dead. You're sure? David pointed. We'll find her body about halfway up the embankment. Then in a voice which struggled to be matter of fact and failed, he added, I don't want to look at her. When you move her out of the way, I mean. Dad, I don't think you should either. Mary walked over to them. The heck? Awesome. Mary walked over to them, rubbing the backs of her thighs, where the ache was the worst. The Ellen body is finished, and it couldn't quite catch me. So it's stuck in its hole again, isn't it? Yes. Mary didn't like the doubtful sound of David's voice. There was more guessing than knowing in it. Did it have anyone else it could get into? Steve asked. Is there anyone else up here? A hermit? An old prospector? No, David said, more certain now. It's fallen and it can't get up, Cynthia said, and pumped her fist at the star-littered sky. Yes! David? Mary asked. He turned to her. We're not done, even if it is stuck in there, are we? We're supposed to go to close the drift. First, the antac, David said, nodding. Then the drift, yeah, seal it in. Like it was before, he glanced at his father. Ralph put an arm around him. If you say so, David. I'm up for it, Steve said. I can't wait to see where this guy takes his shoes off and puts his feet up on the hassock. I was in no particular hurry to get to Bakersfield anyway, Cynthia said. David looked at Mary. Of course, it was God that showed me how to get out, you know. And there's Peter to think about. It killed my husband. I think I owe it a little something for Peter. David looked at Johnny. 2 questions, Johnny said. First, what happens when this is over? What happens here? If the Desperation Mining Corporation comes back in and starts work in the China pit again, they'll most likely reopen the China shaft, won't they? So what good is it? David actually grinned. To Mary, he looked relieved, as if he had expected a much tougher question. That's not our problem. That's God's problem. Ours is to close the antac and the tunnel from from there to the outside. Then we ride away and never look back. What's your other question? Can I take you out for an ice cream when this is over? Tell you some high school war stories? Sure. As long as I can tell you to stop when they get, boring. Boring stories are not in my repertoire, Johnny said loftily. The boy walked back to the truck with Mary, slipping his arm around her waist, leaning his head against her arm as if she was his mother. Mary guessed she could be that for a while, if he needed her to be. Steve and Cynthia took the cab. Ralph and Johnny Marinville sat on the floor of the box across from Mary and David. When the truck stopped halfway up the grade, Mary felt David's grip on her waist tighten, put an arm around his shoulders. They had come to the place where his mother, her shell anyway, had finished up. He knew it as well as she did. He was breathing rapidly and shallowly through his mouth. Mary put a hand on the side of his head and urged him wordlessly with it. He came willingly enough, putting his face against her breast. The light, rapid mouth breathing went on, and then she felt the first of his tears wetting her shirt. Across from her, David's father was sitting, with his knees pulled up to his chest and his hands over his face. "That's all right, David," she murmured, and began stroking his hair. "That's all right." Door slammed, feet crunched on the gravel. Then, faintly, Cynthia Smith's voice, full of horror. "Oh, geez, look at her!" Steve, "Be quiet, stupid, they'll hear you." Cynthia, "Oh, sorry, sugar. Oh, sugar, sorry." Steve, "Come on, help me." Ralph took his hands away from his face, wiped a sleeve across his eyes, then came across to Mary's side of the truck and put his arm around David. David groped for his father's hand and took it. Ralph's stricken, streaming eyes met Mary's, and she began to cry herself. She could now hear shuffling steps from outside as Steve and Cynthia carried Ellen out of the road. There was a pause, a little grunt of effort from the girl, and then the footsteps came back to the truck. Mary was suddenly sure that Steve would walk around to the back and tell the boy and his father some outrageous lie. Foolishness about how Ellen looked peaceful, like she was maybe just taking a nap out here in the middle of nowhere. She tried to send him a message. "Don't do it. Don't come back here and tell well-meaning lies. It can only make things worse. They've been in desperation. They've seen what's there. Don't try and kid them about what's out here." The steps paused. Cynthia murmured. Steve said something in return. Then they got back into the truck. The door slammed, the engine revved, and they started off again. David kept his face pressed against her a moment or two longer, then raised his head. "Thanks." She smiled, and the truck's rear door was still up, and she supposed enough light was getting in for David to see that she had also wept. "Any time," she said. She kissed his cheek. "Really." She clasped her arms around her knees and looked out the back of the truck, watching the dust spoon up. She could still see the blinker light, the yellow spark, and the wide, deep sweep of the dark. But now it was going in the wrong direction, drawing away from them. The world, the one she had always thought to be the only world, also seemed to be drawing away from her now. Malls, restaurants, MTV, Gold's gym workouts, and occasional hot sex in the afternoon, all drawing away. And it's all so easy, she thought, as easy as a penny slipping through a hole in your pocket. "David," Johnny asked, "do you know how Tack got into Ripton in the first place?" David shook his head. Johnny nodded, as if that was what he had expected, and sat back, resting his head against the side of the truck. Mary realized that, as exasperating as Marinville could be, she sort of liked him, and not just because he had come back with David. She had sort of liked him ever since they were looking for guns, she guessed. She'd scared him, and he had bounced back. But he had bounced back. She guessed he was a kind of guy who had made a second career out of bouncing back from stuff. And when he wasn't concentrating on being an asshole, he could be amusing. The .30-06 was laying beside him. Johnny felt around for it, without raising his head, picked it up, and laid it across his knees. "I suspect I may miss a lecture tomorrow evening," he said to the ceiling. It was to be on the subject punks and post-literates. American writing in the 21st century. I shall have to return the advance. Sad, 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 George and Martha. That's from Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf? Mary said. Edward Albee. We're not all boozers on this bus. Sorry, Johnny said, sounding startled. Just be sure to put the apology in your journal, she said, without the slightest idea of what she was talking about. He lowered his head to look at her, frowned for a moment, then started laughing. After a moment, Mary joined in. Then David was also laughing, and Ralph joined in. His was surprisingly high-pitched for a big man, a kind of cartoon tee-hee, and thinking that made Mary laugh even harder. It hurt her scraped stomach, but the hurt didn't stop her. Steve pounded on the back of the cab. It was impossible to tell if his muffled voice was amused or alarmed. What's going on? In his best lion's voice, Johnny Marinville roared back. Be quiet, you Texas Longhorn. We're discussing literature back here. Mary screamed with laughter. One hand pressed to the base of her throat, the other curled against her throbbing belly. She wasn't able to stop until the truck reached the crest of the embankment, crossed the rim, and started down the far side. Then all the humor went out of her at once. The others stopped about the same time. Do you feel it? David asked his father. I feel something. Mary started shivering. She tried to remember if she had been shivering before, while she was laughing, and couldn't. She felt something, yes. She had no doubt that they did. They might have felt even more if they had been out here earlier. If they had to get up this same road before the bleeding thing just behind could. Push it out of your head, Mare. Push it out and lock the door. Mary, David asked. She looked at him. It won't be much longer. Good. 5 minutes later, very long minutes, the truck stopped and the cab doors opened. Steve and Cynthia came around to the back. Hop out, you guys, Steve said. Last stop. Mary worked herself out of the truck, wincing at every move. She hurt all over, but her legs were the worst. If she had sat in the back of the truck much longer, she reckoned she probably wouldn't be able to walk at all. Johnny, do you still have those aspirin? He handed them over. She took 3, washed them down with the last of her jolt. Then she walked around to the front of the truck. They were at the bottom of the china pit. First time for the others, second for her. The field office was near. Looking at it, thinking of what was inside, and of how close she had probably come to ending her existence in there, made her feel like screaming. Then her eyes fixed on the cruiser, the driver's door still open, the hood still raised, the air cleaner still lying by the left front tire. Put your arm around me, she told Johnny. He did, looking down at her with a raised eyebrow. Now walk me over to that car. Why? There's something I have to do. Mary, the sooner we start, the sooner we finish, David said. This will only take a second. Come on, Shakespeare, let's go. He walked her over to the car, his arm around her waist, the 30-06 in his free hand. She supposed he could feel her trembling, but that was all right. She nerved herself, gnawing at her lower lip, remembering the ride into town in the back of this car, sitting with Peter behind the mesh, smelling Old Spice and the metallic scent of her own fear. No door handles, no window cranks, and nothing to look at but the back of Entrogen's sunburned neck and that stupid black-eyed bear stuck to the dashboard. She leaned into Entrogen's stink, except it was really tax stink. She knew that now, and ripped the bear off the dashboard. Now its blank, Cantoy eyes stared directly up at hers, as if asking her what all this foolishness could possibly be about, what good it could possibly accomplish, what evil it could possibly change. Well, she told it, you're gone, motherfucker, and that's step 1. She dropped it to the rough surface of the pit, and then stomped down on it, hard. She felt it crunch under her sneaker. It was, in some fundamental way, the most satisfying moment of the whole miserable nightmare. Don't tell me, Johnny said. It's some new variation of EST therapy, a symbolic affirmation expressly designed for stressful life passages, sort of an I'm okay, you're stomped to shit kind of thing, or shut up, she said, not unkindly, and you can let me loose. You can let loose of me now. Do I have to? His hand moved on her waist. I was just getting familiar with the topography. Too bad. I'm not a map. Johnny dropped his hand and they walked back to the others. David, Steve asked, is that the place? He pointed past the cluster of heavy machinery and to the left of the rusty Quonset with the stove stack. About 20 yards up the slope was a squarish hole she had been seen earlier. Then she hadn't given it much consideration, as she'd had other fish to fry, staying alive chiefly. But now looking at it gave her a bad feeling, a weak in the knees feeling. Well, she thought, I did the bear anyway. It'll never stare at anyone else cooped up in the back of that police cruiser. There's that much. That's it, David said, China shaft. Can tack and can ta, his father said, as if in a dream. Yes. And we have to blow it up? Steve asked. Just how do we go about that? David pointed to the concrete cube near the field office. First, we have to get inside there. They walked over to the powder magazine. Ralph yanked at the padlock on the door, as if to get the feel of it, then racked the Ruger. The metallic clack-clack sound it made was very loud in the stillness of the pit. The rest of you stand back, he said. This always works great in the movies, but in real life, who knows? Wait a sec, Johnny said, and he ran back to the router truck. They heard him rummaging through the cartons of stuff just behind the cab, and then, oh, there you are, you ugly thing. He came back carrying a Black Bell motorcycle helmet with a full face shield. He handed it to Ralph. Brain Bucket Deluxe. I hardly ever wear this one because there's too much of it. I get it over my head and my claustrophobia kicks in. Put it on. Ralph did. The helmet made him look like a futuristic welder. Johnny stepped back from him as he turned to the lock again. So did the others. Mary had her hands on David's shoulders. Why don't you guys turn around, Ralph said. His voice was muffled by the helmet. Mary kept expecting David to protest, concern for his father. Perhaps even exaggerated concern wouldn't be unusual, given the fact that he had lost the other two members of his family in the last 12 hours. But David said nothing. His face was only a pale blur in the dark, impossible to read. But she sensed no agitation in him. Certainly the shoulders under her hands were calm enough, at least for now. Maybe he saw it was going to be all right, she thought, in that vision he had, or whatever it was, or maybe. She didn't want to finish the thought, but was slow closing it off. Maybe he just knows there's no other choice. There was a long moment of silence, very long, it seemed to Mary, and then a high whip-crack rifle report that should have echoed and didn't. It was just there, and then gone, absorbed by the walls and benches and valleys of the open pit. In its aftermath, she heard one startled bird cry, "Quack!" and then nothing more. She wondered why Tack hadn't sent the animals against them, as it had sent them against so many of the people in town. Because the 6 of them together were something special? Maybe. If so, it was David who had made them special. The way a single great player can elevate a whole team. They turned and saw Ralph bent over the padlock. To Mary, he looked like a pieman bent over Simple Simon on the Howard Johnson signs. Peering at it through the helmet's faceplate, the lock was now warped and twisted, with a large black bullet hole through the center of it. But when he yanked on it, it continued to hold fast. One more time, he said, and twirled his finger at them, telling them to turn around. They did, and there was another whip crack. No bird cry followed this one. Mary supposed whatever had called was far away by now, although she had heard no flapping wings. Not that she would have, probably, with 2 gunshots ringing in her ears. This time Ralph yanked, and the lock's arm popped free of its ruined innards. Ralph pulled it off the hasp and threw it aside. When he took Johnny's helmet off, he was grinning. David ran to him and gave him a high five. Good going, Dad! Steve pulled the door open and peered in. Man, darker than a carload of assholes. Is there a light switch? Cynthia asked. No windows, there must be. He felt around, first to the right, then the left. Watch for spiders, Mary said nervously. There could be spiders. Here it is. I got it, Steve said. There was a click, 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 but no light. Who's still got a flashlight? Cynthia asked. I must have left mine back in the damn movie theater. I don't have it anymore. There was no answer. Mary had also had a flashlight, the one she'd found in the field office, but she thought she had tucked it in, and she thought she had tucked it into the waistband of her jeans after disabling the pickup trucks. If so, it was gone now. The hatchet, too. She must have lost both items in her flight from the pit. Crap, Johnny said. Boy Scouts we ain't. There's one in the truck behind the seat, Steve said, under the maps. Why don't you go get it, Johnny said. For a moment or two, Steve didn't move. He was looking at Johnny with a strange expression. One Mary couldn't read on his face. Johnny saw it too. What? Something wrong? Nope, Steve said. Nothing wrong, boss. Then step to it. 3. Steve Ames marked the exact moment when control over their little expeditionary force passed from David to Johnny. The moment when the boss became the boss again. Why don't you go get it? He'd said. A question that wasn't a question at all, but the first real order Marinville had given him since they'd started out in Connecticut. Johnny on his motorcycle, Steve rolling leisurely along behind in the truck, puffing the occasional cheap cigar. He had called him boss until Johnny told him to stop, because it was a tradition in the entertainment business. In the theater, scene shifters called the stage manager boss. On the movie set, key grips called the director boss. Out on tour, roadies called the tour manager or the guys in the band boss. He had simply carried that part of his old life over into this job. But he hadn't thought of Johnny as the boss, in spite of his booming stage voice and his chin thrust forward. I know exactly what I'm doing manner until now. And this time, when Steve called him boss, Johnny hadn't objected. Why don't you go get it? A nominal question, just 6 words, and everything had changed. What's changed? What exactly? I don't know, he murmured, opening the driver's side door of the Ryder truck and starting to rummage through the crap behind the seat. That's the hell of it. I don't really know. The flashlight, a long-barreled 6-battery job, was under the crushed litter of maps, along with the first aid kit and a cardboard box with a few road flares in it. He tried the light, saw that it worked, and jogged back to the others. Look for spiders first, Cynthia said. Her voice was just a little too high for normal conversation. Spiders and snakes, just like in that old song. God, I hate them. Steve stepped into the powder magazine and shone his light around, first running it over the floor, then the cinder block walls, then the ceiling. No spiders, he reported. No snakes. David, stand right outside the door, Johnny said. We shouldn't all cram in there together, I think. And if you see anyone or anything, give a yell, David finished. Don't worry. Steve centered the beam of the flashlight on a sign in the middle of the floor. It was on a stand, like the one in restaurants that said, please wait for hostess to seat you. Only this one said in big red letters was, warning, warning, warning. Blast agents and boosters must be kept separate. This is a federal record. Carelessness with explosives will not be tolerated. The rear wall was studded with spikes driven into the cinder blocks. Hung on these were coils of wire and fat white cord. Det cord, Steve assumed. Against the right and left walls, facing each other like bookends with no books between them, were 2 heavy wooden chests. The one marked dynamite and blasting caps, and use extreme caution, was open, the lid up like the lid of a child's toy box. The other, marked simply blasting agent, in black letters against an orange background, was padlocked shut. That's the ANFO, Johnny said, pointing at the padlocked cabinet. Acronym stands for ammonium nitrate and fuel oil. How do you know that? Mary asked. Picked it up somewhere, Johnny said absently. Just picked it up somewhere. Well, if you think I'm going to blow the padlock off that one, you're nuts, Ralph said. You guys have any ideas that don't involve shooting? Not just the second, Johnny said. But he didn't sound very concerned. Steve walked toward the dynamite chest. No dino in there, Johnny said, still sounding weirdly serene. He was right about the dynamite, but the chest was far from empty. The body of a man in jeans and a Georgetown Hoyas t-shirt was crammed into it. He had been shot in the head. His glazed eyes stared up at Steve from below what might once have been blonde hair. It was hard to tell. Steeling himself against the wall, Steve leaned over and worked on the key ring hanging on the man's belt. "What is it?" Cynthia asked, starting toward him. A beetle came out of the corpse's open mouth and trundled down his chin. Now Steve could hear a faint rustling. More insects under the dead guy, or maybe one of his nice new friends' beloved rattlers. "Nothing," he said. "Stay where you are." The keyring was stubborn. After a few fruitless efforts to depress the cleft-shaped clip holding it to the belt loop, Steve simply tore the whole thing off, loop and all. He closed the lid and crossed the room with the keyring. Johnny, he noticed, was standing about 3 paces inside the door, gazing raptly down at his motorcycle helmet. "Alas, poor urine," he said. "I knew him well." "Johnny, you okay?" "Fine." Johnny tucked the motorcycle helmet under his arm and smiled winningly at Steve, but his eyes looked haunted. Steve gave the keys to Ralph. "One of these, maybe." It didn't take long. The third key Ralph tried slid into the padlock on the chest marked blasting agent. A moment later, the 5 of them were looking inside. The chest had been partitioned into 3 bins. Those on the ends were empty. The one in the middle was half full of what looked like long cheesecloth bags. Littered among them was a few escapees, round pellets that looked to Steve like whitewashed birdshot. Birdshot. The bags had drawstring tops. He lifted one out. It looked like a bratwurst, and he guessed it weighed about 10 pounds. Written on the side in black were the letters "ANFO." Below them, in red, "Caution, flammable, explosive." "Okay," Steve said, "but how are we going to set it off with no booster?" "You were right, boss. No dynamite, no blasting caps. Just a guy with a 30-30 haircut. The demolitions foreman, I assume." Johnny looked at Steve and then at the others. "I wonder if the rest of you would step out with David for a moment. I'd like to speak to Steve alone." "Why?" Cynthia asked instantly. "Because I need to," Johnny said in an oddly gentle voice. "It's a little unfinished business, that's all. An apology. I don't apologize well under any circumstances, but I'm not sure I could do it at all with an audience." Mary said, "I hardly think this is the time." The boss had been signaling urgently with his eyes. "It's okay," Steve said. "It'll be quick." "And don't go empty-handed," Johnny said. "Each of you take a bag of this instant 4th of July. My understanding is that without something explosive to boost it, it's more like instant campfire," Ralph said. "I want to know what's going on here," Cynthia said. She sounded worried. "Nothing," Johnny told her, with his voice soothing. "Really?" "The fuck there ain't," Cynthia said morosely. But she went with the others, each of them carrying a bag of ANFO. Before Johnny could say anything, David slipped back inside. There were still traces of dried soap on his cheeks, and his lids were tinged purple. Steve had once dated a girl who wore eyeshadow, that exact same color. On David, it looked like shock instead of glamour. "Is everything okay?" David asked. He glanced briefly at Steve, but it was Johnny he was talking to. "Yeah, Steve, give David a bag of ANFO." David stood a moment longer, holding the bag Steve handed him, looking down at it, lost in thought. Abruptly, he looked up at Johnny and said, "Turn out your pockets, all of them." "What?" Steve began. Johnny shushed him, smiling oddly. It was the smile of someone who has bitten into something that tastes both bitter and compelling. "David knows what he's doing." He unbuckled the chaps and turned out the pockets of his jeans underneath, handing Steve his goods: the famous wallet, his keys, the hammer, which had been stuck in his belt to hold as he did. He bowed forward so David could look into his shirt pocket. Then he unbuckled his pants and pushed them down. Underneath, he was wearing blue bikini briefs. His not so his not inconsiderate gut hung over them. He looked to Steve like one of those rich older guys you saw strolling along the beach sometimes. They knew they were rich, not just because they always wore Rolexes and Oakley sunglasses, but because they dare walk along in those tiny spandex ball huggers in the first place. As if once your income passed a certain figure, your gut became another asset. The boss wasn't wearing spandex, at least. Plain old cotton. He did a 360, arms slightly raised, giving David all the angles and bruises, then pulled up his jeans again. The chaps followed. Satisfied? I'll take off my boots if you're not. No, David said. But he poked his hand into the pockets of the chaps before stepping back. Ah! His face was troubled, but not exactly worried. Go on and have your talk, but hurry it up. And he was gone, leaving Steve and Johnny alone. The boss moved to the rear of the powder magazine as far from the door as possible. Steve followed. Now, he could smell the corpse in the dynamite chest under the stronger fuel oil aroma of the place, and he wanted to get out of here as soon as possible. He wanted to make sure you didn't have a few of those cantas on you, didn't he? Like Audrey? Johnny nodded. He's a wise child. I guess he is. Steve shuffled his feet, looking at them. Then, back up at the boss. Look, you don't need to apologize for buzzing off. The important thing is that you came back. Why don't we just... I owe a lot of apologies, Johnny said. He began taking stuff back, rapidly returning the items to his pockets for which they had come. He took the hammer last, once more tucking it into the belt of his chaps. It's really amazing how much fuckery a person can get up to in the course of one lifetime. But you're really the least of my worries in that respect, Steve, especially now. Just shut up and listen, all right? All right. And this really does have to be speedy. David already suspects I'm up to something. There's another reason why he wanted me to turn out my pockets. There'll come a moment, very soon now, when you're going to have to grab David. When you do, make sure you get a good grip, because he's going to fight like hell. And make sure you don't let go. Why? Will your pal with the creative hairdo help if you ask her to? Probably, but Steve, you have to trust me. Why should I? Because I had a moment of revelation on the way up here. Except, that's way too stiff. I like David's phrase better. He asked me if I got hit by a God bomb. I told him no. But that was another lie. Do you suppose that's why God picked me in the end? Because I'm an accomplished liar? That's sort of funny, but also sort of awful, you know it? What's going to happen? Do you even know? No, not completely. Johnny picked up the 30-06 in one hand and the black visored helmet in the other. He looked back and forth between them, as if comparing their relative worth. I can't do what you want, Steve said flatly. I don't trust you enough to do what you want. You have to, Johnny said, and handed him the rifle. I'm all you have now, but... Johnny came a step closer. To Steve, he no longer looked like the same man who had gotten on the Harley-Davidson back in Connecticut. His absurd new leathers creaking, showing every tooth on his head as the photographers from Life and People and Daily News circled him and clicked away. The change was a little more than a few bruises and a broken nose. He looked younger, stronger. The pomposity had gone out of his face, and somehow frantic vagueness as well. It was only now, observing its absence, that Steve realized how much of the time that look had been there, as if, no matter what he was saying or doing, most of Marinville's attention was taken up by something that wasn't. Something like a misplaced item or a forgotten chore. David thinks God means him to die in order to close tack up in his bolt hole again. The final sacrifice, so to speak. But David's wrong. Johnny's voice cracked at the last word, and Steve was astonished to see that the boss was almost crying. It's not going to be that easy for him. What? Johnny grabbed his arm. His grip was so tight it was painful. Shut up, Steve. Just grab him when the time comes. It's up to you now. It's up to you. Come on now. He bent into the chest, grabbed a bag of Antho by its drawstring, and tossed it to Steve. He got another for himself. Do you know how to set this shit off without any dyno or blasting cabs? Steve asked. You think you do, don't you? What's going to happen? Is God going to send down a lightning bolt? That's what David thinks, Johnny said. And after the sardines and crackers, I'm not surprised. I don't think it'll come to anything that extreme, though. Come on, the hour groweth late. They walked out into what was left of the night and joined the others. Part 4. At the bottom of the slope, 20 yards below the ragged yawn that was the china shaft, Johnny stopped them and told them to tie the drawstrings of the bags together in pairs. He slipped one of those pairs around his neck, the sacks hanging down on either side of his chest like the counterweights of a cuckoo clock. Steve took another pair, and Johnny made no objection when David took the last set from his father and slipped the joined drawstrings around his own neck. Ralph, troubled, looked at Johnny. Johnny glanced at David. David was staring up at the drift opening, then looked back at the boy's father, shook his head, and tapped a finger against his lips. Quiet, Dad. Ralph looked doubtful, but said nothing. Everything all right? Johnny asked. What's going to happen? Mary said. I mean, what's the plan? What we do what God tells us, David said. That's the plan. Come on. It was David who led, going up the slope, side-saddled to keep from falling. There was no wide gravel road here, not even a path, and the ground was evil. Johnny could feel it trying to crumble up from under his boots at every upward lurch. Soon his heart was pounding, and his battered nose was throbbing in sync. He had been a good boy over the last few months, but a lot of chickens, not to mention some roast ducks and a few caviar stuffed quail, were now coming home to roost nevertheless. Yet he felt good. Everything was simple now. That was sort of wonderful. David was in the lead, his father behind him, Steve and Cynthia next. Johnny and Mary Jackson brought up the rear. Why have you still got the motorcycle helmet? She asked. Johnny grinned. She reminded him of Terry in an odd way. Terry as she had been back in the old days. He held the helmet up, stuck it on his hand like a puppet. Ask not for what the bell tolls, he said. It tolls for thee, thou storied honeydew. She gave him a small, breathless laugh. You're nuts. If it had been 40 yards uphill instead of 20, Johnny wasn't sure he could have made it. As it was, the pounding of his heart had become so rapid it seemed like one steady thrum in his chest by the time David reached the ragged tunnel opening, and his thighs felt like spaghetti. Don't weaken now, he told himself. You're into the final straightaway. He made himself move a little faster, suddenly afraid that David might simply turn and go into the shaft before he could get there. It was possible, too. Steve thought the boss knew what was going on, but in fact the boss knew precious little. He was being handed the script a page ahead of the rest of them. That was all. But David waited, and soon they were all clustered on the slope in front of the opening. A dank smell issued from it, chilly and charred at the same time. And there was a sound Johnny associated with elevator shafts, a faint, windy whisper. We ought to pray, David said, sounding timid. He held his hands out to either side of him. His father took one of his hands. Steve put down the 30-06 and took the other. Mary took Ralph's. Cynthia took Steve's. And Johnny stepped between the two women, dropped the helmet between his boots, and the circle was complete. They stood in the darkness of the China Pit, smelling the dank, exhaled breath of the earth, listening to that faint roar, looking at David Carver, who had brought them here. Whose father? David asked them. Our Father, Johnny said, stepping easily onto the road of the old prayer, as if he had never been away. Who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name, thy kingdom come. The others joined in, Cynthia, the minister's daughter, first, Mary last. Thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Amen. Through the Amen, Cynthia continued on, For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen. She looked up with a little twinkle Johnny had come to like quite a lot. That's the way I learned it. Kind of a Protestant dance mix, you know? David was looking at Johnny now. Help me do my best, Johnny said. If you're there, God, and I now have reason to believe you are, help me do my best and not weaken again. I want you to take the request very seriously, because I have a long history of weakening. David, what about you? Anything to say? David shrugged and shook his head. Said it already. He let go of the hands holding his, and the circle broke. Johnny nodded. Okay, let's do it. Do what? Mary asked. Do what? Will you please tell me? I'm supposed to go in, David said, alone. Johnny shook his head. Nope. And don't start in with your God told me to stuff, because right now he's not telling you anything. Your TV screen has got a please stand by sign on it. Am I right? David looked at him uncertainly and wet his lips. Johnny lifted a head toward the waiting darkness of the drift and spoke in a tone of a man conveying a large favor. You can go first, though. How's that? My dad, right behind you. He'll catch you if you fall. No, David said. He suddenly looked scared, terrified. I don't want to. I don't want him in there at all. The roof might cave in or... David, what you want doesn't matter. Cynthia grabbed Johnny's arm. She would have been digging into him if she hadn't nibbed her nails to the quick. Leave him alone. Christ, he saved your fucking life. Can't you quit badgering him? I'm not, Johnny said. At this point, he's badgering himself. If he'll just let go, remember who's in charge. He looked at David. The boy muttered something under his breath, far too low to hear, but Johnny didn't have to hear it to know what he had said. That's right, he's cruel. But you knew that, and you have no control over the nature of God anyway. None of us do. So why don't you relax? David made no reply. His head was bowed, but not in prayer this time. Johnny thought it was resignation. In some way, the boy knew what was coming, and that was the worst part. The cruelest part, if you like. It's not going to be easy for him, he had told Steve in the Powder magazine. But back there, he hadn't really understood how hard could be. First his sis, then his mother, now... Right, he said in a voice as he sounded as dry as the ground they were standing on. First David, then Ralph, then you, Steve. I'll be behind you tonight. Sorry, this morning. It's a case of ladies last. If we have to go in, I want to go in with Steve, Cynthia said. Okay, fine, Johnny said at once. It was as if he had been expecting this. You and I can switch places. Who put you in charge anyway? Mary asked. Johnny turned to her like a snake, startling her in a precarious step backward. Do you want to have to go? He asked with a kind of dangerous good cheer. Because if you do, lass, I'd be happy to turn it over to you. I asked for this no more than David did. So, what do you think? You want to put him on Big Chief's headdress? She shook her head, confused. Easy, boss, Steve murmured. I'm easy, Johnny said. But he wasn't. He looked at David and his father, standing side by side, heads down, hands entwined, and wasn't easy. He could barely believe the enormity of what he was allowing. Could barely believe. Couldn't believe it all was more like it. How else could he go on, except with merciful incomprehension held before him like a shield? How could anyone? Want me to take those bags, Johnny? Cynthia asked timidly. You still sound pretty out of breath, and you look all in, if you don't mind me saying. Oh, I'll be fine. It's not far now, is it, David? No, David said in a small, trembling voice. He appeared not to be just holding his father's hand now, but caressing it as a lover might do. He looked at Johnny with hopeless, pleading eyes, the eyes of someone who almost knows. Johnny looked away, sick in his stomach, feeling simultaneously hot and cold. He met Steve's bewildered, concerned eyes and tried to send him another message. Just hold him when the time comes. Out loud he said, "Give David the flashlight, Steve." For a moment he didn't think Steve would do it. Then he pulled the flashlight out of his back pocket and handed it over. Johnny lifted his hand to the blackness of the shaft again, toward the dead, cold smell of old fire and the faint roaring sound from deep in the middle of the murdered mountain. He listened for some comforting word from Terry, but Terry had split the scene. Maybe just as well. "David," his voice trembling, "will you light us on our way?" I don't want to," David whispered, then pulled in a deep breath. He looked up at the sky, in which the stars were just beginning to pale, and screamed, "I don't want to! Haven't I done enough? Everything you asked? This isn't fair! This isn't fair, and I don't want to!" The last 4 words came out in a desperate, throat-tearing shriek. Mary started forward. Johnny grabbed her arm. "Take your hands off me," she said to David, and silently raised his hand to the drift again. David looked up at his father, with tears running down his cheeks. "Go away, Dad. Go back to the truck." Ralph shook his head. "If you go in, I go in." "Don't! I'm telling you, it won't be good for you." Ralph simply stood his ground and looked patiently at his son. David looked back up at him, then at Johnny's outstretched hand, a hand which now did not simply invite, but demanded, and then turned and walked into the drift. He clicked on the light as he went, and Johnny saw motes dancing in its bright beam. Motes and something else. Something that might have caused the heart of an old prospector to beat faster. A glint of gold. There and then gone. Ralph followed David. Steve came next. The light moved in the boy's hand, tracing first along the rock wall, then an ancient support with a trio of symbols carved into it. Some long-dead China miner's name, perhaps, or the name of his sweetheart, left far behind in the marsh-side huts of Po Yang, and then to the floor, where it picked out a litter of bones, cracked skulls, and rib cages that curved like ghastly Cheshire cat grins. It shifted upward again and to the left. The gold beam came again, this time brighter and more defined. "Hey, look out!" Cynthia cried. "Something's in here with us." There was a fluttering explosion in the dark. It was the sound Johnny associated with his Connecticut childhood, pheasant exploding out of the underbrush and into the air as twilight drew down toward dark. For a moment the smell of the mine was stronger, as unseen wings drove the ancient air against his face and pulses. Mary screamed. The flashlight beam jagged upward at an angle, and for just one moment it pinpointed a nightmarish mid-air apparition. Something with wings and glaring golden eyes and outstretched talons. It was David the eyes were glaring at. David, it wanted. "Look out!" Ralph yelled, and threw himself over David's back, driving him down to the bone-littered floor of the shaft. The flashlight fell from the boy's hand as he went down, kicking up just enough light to be confusing. Unclear shapes strove together in its reflective glow. David under his father, and the shadow of the eagle flexing and swelling above them both. "Shoot it!" Cynthia screamed. "Steve, shoot it! It's going to tear his head off!" Johnny grabbed the barrel of the .30-06 as Steve brought it up. "No, a gunshot'll bring the whole works down on top of us." The eagle screeched, wings battering Carver's head. Ralph tried to fend the bird off with his left hand. It seized one of his fingers with the hook of its beak and tore it off. And then its talons plunged into Ralph Carver's face, like strong fingers into dough. "Daddy, no!" David shrieked. Steve shoved into the tangle of shadows, and when the side of his foot kicked the downed flashlight, Johnny was treated with a better view than he wanted of the bird with Ralph's head in its grip. Its wings set furious swirls of dust in motion from the floor and the old shaft walls. Ralph's head wagged wildly from side to side, but his body covered David almost completely. Steve drew the rifle back, meaning to swing it, and the butt cracked against the wall. There wasn't room. He jabbed it forward instead, like a lance. The eagle turned its gimlet gaze on him, talons shifting their grip on Ralph. Its wings were soft thunder in the closed space. Johnny saw Ralph's finger jutting from the side of its beak. Steve jabbed forward again, this time catching the eagle squarely and knocking the finger out of the beak. Its head was driven back against the wall, its talons flexed. One drove deeper into Ralph's face, the other lifted, plunged it into his neck, and ripped it open. The bird screamed, perhaps in rage, perhaps in triumph. Mary screamed with it. "God, no!" David howled, with his voice cracking. "Oh, God, please, make it stop hurting my daddy!" "This is hell," Johnny thought calmly. Stepping forward and then kneeling, he seized the talon buried in Ralph's throat. It was like grabbing some exotically ugly curio which had been upholstered in alligator hide. He twisted it as hard as he could and heard a brittle tearing sound. Above him, Steve drove forward with the stock of the .30-06 again, slamming the eagle's head against the rock side of the shaft. There was a crunch. The wing batted down on Johnny's head. It was like the buzzard in the parking lot all over again. Back to the Future, he thought. Let go of the talon in favor of the wing and yanked. The bird came toward him, squalling its ugly, ear-splitting cry, and Ralph came with it, pulled by the talon still buried in his cheek, temple, and orbit of his left eye. Johnny thought Ralph was either unconscious or already dead. He hoped he was already dead. David crawled out from under, face dazed, his shirt soaked with his father's blood. In a moment, he would seize the flashlight and plunge deeper into the mine if they weren't quick. "Steve!" Johnny shouted, reaching blindly over his head and encircling the eagle's back. It plunged and twisted in his hold like the spine of a bucking bronco. "Steve, finish it! Finish it!" Steve drove the stock of the rifle into the bird's gullet, tilting its shadowy head toward the ceiling. At that moment, Mary darted forward. She seized the eagle's neck and wrung it with bitter efficiency. There was a muffled crack, and suddenly the talon buried in Ralph's face relaxed. David's father fell to the floor of the mine, his forehead striking a ribcage, and powdered it to dust. David turned, saw his father lying motionless and face down. His eyes cleared. He even nodded, as if to say, "Pretty much what I expected," then bent to pick up the flashlight. It was only when Johnny grabbed him around the waist that his calm broke and he began to struggle. "Let go!" he screamed. "It's my job! Mine!" "No, David," Johnny said, holding on for dear life. "It's not." He tightened his grip across David's chest with his left hand, wincing as the boy's heels printed fresh pain on his shins, and let his right hand slip down to the boy's hip. From there, it moved with a good pickpocket's unobtrusive speed. Johnny took from David what he had been instructed to take, and left something too. "He can't take them all and then not let me finish. He can't do that. He can't." Johnny winced as one of David's feet connected with his left kneecap. "Steve!" Steve was staring with horrified fascination at the eagle, which was still twitching and slowly fanning one wing. Its talons were red. "Steve, goddammit!" He looked up, as if startled out of a dream. Cynthia was kneeling beside Ralph, feeling for a pulse and crying loudly. "Steve, come here!" Johnny shouted. "Help me!" Steve came over and grabbed David, who began to struggle even harder. "No!" David whipped his head from side to side in a frenzy. "No, it's my job. It's mine. He can't take them all and leave me. Do you hear? He can't take them all and—" "David, quit it." David stopped struggling and merely hung in Steve's arms like a puppet with its strings cut. His eyes were red and raw. Johnny thought he had never seen such desolation and loss in a human face. The motorcycle helmet was lying where Johnny had dropped it when the eagle attacked. He bent, picked it up, and looked at the boy in Steve's arms. Steve looked the way Johnny felt, sick, lost, bewildered. "David," he began. "Is God in you?" David asked. "Can you feel him in there, Johnny? Like a hand or a fire?" Yes, Johnny said. Then you won't take this wrong. David spit in his face. It was warm on the skin below Johnny's eyes, like tears. Johnny made no effort to wipe away the boy's spittle. Listen to me, David. I'm going to tell you something you didn't learn from your minister or your Bible. For all you know, it's a message from God himself. Are you listening? David only looked at him, saying nothing. You said God is cruel, the way a person who's lived his whole life in Tahiti may say snow is cold. You knew, but you didn't understand. He stepped close to David and put his palms on the boy's cold cheeks. Do you know how cruel your God can be, David? How fascinatingly cruel? David waited, saying nothing. Maybe listening, maybe not. Johnny couldn't tell. Sometimes he makes us live. Johnny turned, scooped up the flashlight, started down the drift, then turned back once again. Go to your friend Brian, David. Go to your friend and make him your brother. Then start telling yourself there was an accident out here on the highway, a bad one. A no-brain drunk crossed the center line. The RV you were in rolled over, and only you survived. It happens all the time. Just read the paper. But that's not the truth. It might as well be. And when you get back to Ohio or Indiana or wherever it is you hang your hat, pray for God to get you over this, to make you well again. As for now, you're excused. I'll never say another, what? What did you say? I said, you're excused. Johnny was looking at him fixedly. Excused early, he turned his head. Get him out of here, Stephen. Get them all out of here. Boss, what? The tour's over, Tex. Get them into the truck and up the road, and if you want to be safe, I'd get going right now. Johnny turned and went jogging down into China Shaft, the light bobbing ahead of him into the black. Soon, that was gone too. 5. He tripped over something in spite of the flashlight, almost went sprawling, and slowed to a walk. The China miners had dropped what stuff they had in their frantic, useless rush to escape. And in the end, they had dropped themselves as well. He walked over a littered landscape of bones, powdering them to dust, and moved the light in a steady triangle, left to right, down to the floor, up to the left again, to keep the landscape clear and current in his mind. He saw that the walls fairly jostled with Chinese characters, as if survivors of the cave-in had succumbed to some sort of writing mania as death first approached, and then overtook them. In addition to the bones, he saw tin cups, ancient picks with rusty heads, funny short handles, small rusty boxes on straps, what David had called sceners, he imagined, rotted clothes, deerskin slippers. They were tiny slippers for infants, one might have thought, and at least 3 pairs of wooden shoes. One of these held the stub of a candle that might have been dipped the year before Abe Lincoln was elected president. And everywhere, scattered among the remains, were cantas. Coyotes with spider tongues, spiders with weird albino rattlings poking from their mouths. Rattlings poking from their mouths. Spread-winged bats with obscene baby tongues. The babies were leering, gnomish. Some depicted nightmarish creatures that had never existed on Earth. Halfling freaks that made Johnny's eyes hurt. He could feel the cantas calling to him, pulling him as the moon pulls at salt water. He had sometimes been pulled in that same way by a sudden craving to have a drink or to gobble a sweet dessert or to lick along the smooth velvet lining of a woman's mouth with his tongue. The cantas spoke in tones of madness which he recognized from his own past life. Sweetly reasonable voices proposing unspeakable acts. But the cantas would have no power over him unless he stopped and bent and touched them. If he could avoid that, avoid despair that would come disguised as curiosity, He reckoned he would be all right. Had Steve gotten them out yet? He'd have to hope so, and hope that Steve could manage to get them a good distance away in his trusty truck before the end came. The hell of a bang was coming. A hell of a bang was coming. He only had 2 bags of ANFO hung around his neck on the knotted drawstrings, but that would be plenty, all they had ever needed. It had seemed wiser not to tell the others that, though, safer. Now he would hear the soft groaning sound of which David had spoken, the squall and shift of hornfells, as if the very earth were speaking, protesting his intrusion. And now he could see a dim zigzag of red light up ahead. Hard to tell how far away in the dark. The smell was stronger too, and clearer, cold ashes. To his left, a skeleton, probably not Chinese judging by the size, knelt against the wall, as if it had died praying. Abruptly, it turned its head and favored Johnny Marinville with its dead, toothy grin. Get out while there's still time. Tak and wa. Tak awan, tak Allah. Johnny punted the skull as if it were a football. It disintegrated, almost vaporized, into bone fragments, and he hurried on toward the red light, which was coming through a rift in the wall. The hole looked just big enough for him to squeeze through. He looked outside it, looking into the light, not able to see much from the drift side, hearing David's voice in his head almost as a trance subject must hear the voice of the hypnotist who had put him under. At 10 minutes past 1 in the afternoon of September 21st, the guys at the face broke through into what they first thought was a cave. Johnny tossed the flashlight aside, he wouldn't need it anymore, and squeezed through the gap. And as he passed into the antac, that murmuring elevator sound they had heard at the entrance to the drift seems to fill his head with whispering voices, enticing, cajoling, forbidding, all around him, turning the antac chamber into a fantastic hollow column lit by dim scarlet tones. Lit by dim scarlet tones were carved stone faces. All around him, turning the antac chambers into a fantastic hollow column lit with dim scarlet tones, were carved faces. There we go. Wolf and coyote, hawk and eagle, rat and scorpion. From the mouth of each protruded not another animal, but an amorphous reptilian shape Johnny could barely bring himself to look at, and could not really see in any case. Was it tack? The tack at the bottom of the innie? Did it matter? How had it gotten ripped in? If it was stuck down there, actually, how had it gotten ripped in? He suddenly realized he was crossing the antac, walking toward the innie. He tried to stop his legs and discovered he couldn't. He tried to imagine Corey Ripton making the same discovery and found it was easy. Easy. The long bags of ANFO swung back and forth against his chest, images dancing crazily in his mind. Terry grabbing his belt loops and yanking him tight to her belly as he began to come. The best orgasm of his life, and it had gone nowhere but into his pants. Tell that one to Ernest Hemingway, coming out of the pool at the Bel Air, laughing, hair plastered to his forehead, holding up the beer bottle as the cameras flashed. Bill Harris telling him that going cross-country on his motorcycle might change his life and his whole career. If he was really up to it, that was. Last of all, he saw the cop's empty gray eyes staring at him in the rearview mirror. The cop saying he thought Johnny would shortly come to understand a great deal more about Numa, Soma, and Sarks than he had previously. And that he had been right. About that he had been right. God protect me long enough to get this done, he said, and allowed himself to be drawn toward the innie. Could he stop even if he tried? Best not to know, maybe. There were dead animals lying in a rotting ring around the hole in the floor. David Carver's well of the worlds, coyotes and buzzards mostly. But he also saw spiders and a few scorpions. He had an idea that these last protectors had died when the eagle had died. Some withdrawing force had hammered the life out of them just as the life had been hammered from Audrey Weiler, almost as soon as Steve had slapped the cantas out of her hand. Now smoke began to rise out of the innie, except it wasn't smoke at all, not really. It was some sort of greasy, brown-black muck, and it began to curl toward him. Johnny saw it was alive. It looked like clutching 3-fingered hands on the ends of scrawny arms. They were not ectoplasmic, those arms, but neither were they strictly physical. Like the carved shapes looming above and all around him. Looking at them made Johnny's head hurt, the way a kid's head hurt when he staggered off some viciously swerving amusement park ride. It was the stuff that had crazed the miners, of course. The stuff that had changed Ripton. The glassless windows of the Pier and Mo leered at him, telling him what exactly. He could almost hear. K-da-man, open your mouth. And yes, his mouth was open, wide open, like when you go to the dentist. Please open wide, Mr. Marinville. Open wide. You lousy, contemptible excuse for a writer. What's up?
She kept just excessively looking at his ear.
All right. You make me furious. You make me sick with rage. But go on, open wide. K-da-man. You fucking greyhound pretentious motherfucker. We'll fix you up. Make you good as new. Better than new. Open wide. Open wide. K-da-man, open wide. The smoke. Muck. Whatever it was. Those were no longer hands on the ends of the arms, but tubes. No, not tubes. Holes. Yes, that was it. Holes like eyes. 3 of them. Maybe more. But 3 he could see clearly. A triangle of holes. 2 on top and 1 underneath. Holes like whispering eyes. Like blast holes. That's right, David said. That's right, Johnny. To blast tack right into you. The way it blasted itself into Carrie Ripton. The only way it has to get out of the hole is hole it's in down there. The hole that's too small for anything but this stuff, this jizz, 2 for your nose and 1 for your mouth. The brownish black muck twisted toward him, both horrible and enticing. Holes that were mouths, mouths that were eyes, eyes that whispered, promised. He realized he had an erection. Not exactly a great time for one, but when had that ever stopped him? Now, sucking. He could feel them sucking the air out of his mouth, his throat. He snapped his mouth shut and yanked the motorcycle helmet down over his head. Boop. He was just in time. A moment later, the brownish ribbons encountered the plexi face shield and spread over it like an unpleasant wet smooching sound. With an unpleasant wet smooching sound. For a moment, he could see spreading suckers like kissing lips, and then they were gone, lost in filthy smears of brown particulate matter. Johnny reached out, seized the brown stuff floating before him, and twisted it in opposite directions, as if he were wringing out a face cloth. There was a needling sensation in his palms and fingers, and the flesh went numb. But the brown stuff tore away, some of it drawing back toward the innie, some dripping to the chamber's floor. He reached the edge of the hole, standing between a heap of feathers that had been a buzzard or a coyote laying dead on its side. He looked down, reaching up to touch the hanging baskets of Anfo as he did, pressing them with tingling, half-numb hands. Do you know how to set this stuff off without dyno or blasting caps? Steven asked. You do, don't you? Or you think you do. I hope I do, Johnny said. His voice was flat and strange inside the helmet. Then come on! A mad voice cried out from below him. Johnny recoiled in terror and surprise. It was the voice of the cop, of Collie Entrogen. Come on, Takala, Pier and Mo. Come on, you rotten cocksucker. Let's see how brave you are. Tack. He tried to take a step backward. Maybe think this over. But tendrils of muck curled around his ankles like hands and jerked his feet out from under him. He went into the wall in a graceless 5 feet-first dive, hammering the back of his head against the edge as he fell. If not for the helmet, his skull would likely have been crushed in. He curled the bags of anfo protectively against his chest, making breasts of them. Then the pain came, first biting, then searing, then seeming to eat him alive. The innie was funnel-shaped, but the descending, narrowing circle was lined with crystal outcrops of quartz and cracked hornfells. Johnny slid down this like a kid down a slide that had grown crooked glass thorns. His legs were protected to some degree by the leather chaps, and his head was protected by the motorcycle helmet, but his back and buttocks were shredded in moments. He put down his forearms in an effort to break his slide. Needles of stone tore through them. He saw his shirt sleeves. It was Ellie Carver's voice. "Talk Allah, you interfering bastard. Ento ta alak," raving, cursing him in 2 languages. Insane in any dimension, Johnny thought, and laughed in his agony. He lurched forward, meaning to somersault or die trying. Time to tenderize the other side, he thought, and laughed harder than ever. He could feel blood pouring into his boots like warm water. The brown-black vapor was all around him, whispering and smearing gaping sucker mouths across the helmet's faceplate. They appeared and disappeared, then appeared again, rubbing and making those low, suggestive smooching sounds. He couldn't get off his back the way he wanted to. Couldn't somersault. The angle of descent was too steep. He turned over on his side instead, clutching at the crystal outcrops that were tearing him open, slashing his hands and not caring, needing to stop himself before he was literally cut to ribbons. Then suddenly, it was over. He lay folded at the bottom of the funnel, bleeding everywhere, it felt like. His slit nerves trying to drown out all rational thought of their mindless screaming. He looked up and saw a wide swath of blood marking his path down the inclined, curving wall. Strips of cloth and leather, his shirt, his Levi's, his chaps, hung from some of the jetting crystals. Smoke curled up between his fingers, coming from a hole at the bottom of the funnel and trying to seize his crotch. "Let go," he said. "My God commands it." The brownish-black smoke fell back, curling around his thighs in filthy banners. "I can let you live," the voice said. It was no wonder, Johnny thought, that tack was caught on the other side of the funnel. The hole in which it narrowed was stringent, no more than an inch across. Red light pulsed in it like a wink. "I can heal you, make you well, let you live." "Yeah, but can you win me a goddamn Nobel Prize for Literature?" Johnny slipped the bags of anfo off his neck, then yanked the hammer from his belt. He'd have to work fast. He was cut in what felt like a billion pieces, and already he could feel the grayness of blood loss crowding in on his mind. It made him think of Connecticut again, the way the fogs came in after dark during the last weeks of March and the first weeks of April. The old-timers called it Strawberry Spring. God knew why. Yes, I can do that." The voice from the narrow red throat sounded eager. It also sounded frightened. "Anything! Success, money, women, and I can heal you. Don't forget that. I can heal you." Can you bring David's father back?" Silence from the innie. Now the brownish-black mist coming out of the hole found the long confusion of slashes along his back and legs, and suddenly he felt as if he had been attacked by moray eels or piranhas. He screamed. "I can make the pain stop," Tack said from his tiny hole. "All you have to do is ask. And stop yourself, of course." With sweat stinging his eyes, Johnny used the claw end of the hammer to tear open one of the anfo bags. He tilted the slit over the tiny hole, spread the cloth, and poured through one cupped, bloody hand. The red light was obliterated at once, as if the thing that down there feared it might inadvertently set off the charge itself. "You can't!" it screamed, its voice muffled now, but Johnny heard it clearly enough in his head. Just the same. "You can't, damn you! Allah, Osdam, you bastard!" "Unlaw yourself," Johnny said, as a big, fat candelac in the bargain. Oh, and a big, fat candelac in the bargain. The first bag was empty. Johnny could see dim whiteness in the hole where there had been only black and pulsing red before. The gullet leading back to Talk's world, or plane, or dimension wasn't that long then. Not in physical terms of measurement, but was the pain in his back and legs less? Maybe I've just gone numb, he thought. Not a new state for me, actually. He grabbed the second bag of info and saw one entire side of it was sopped through with his blood. He felt a growing weakness to go along with the fog in his head. Had to be quick now. Had to go like the wind. He tore open the second bag with the hammer's claw, trying to steel himself against the shrieks in his head. Tack had lapsed entirely into the other language now. He turned the bag over the hole and watched info pellets pour out. The whiteness grew brighter as the gullet filled. By the time the bag was empty, the top layer of pellets was only 3 inches or so down. Just room enough, Johnny thought. He became aware that He became aware that a stillness had fallen here in the well, and in the antac above, there was only that faint whispering, which could have been the calling of ghosts that had been penned up in here ever since the 21st of September 1859. If so, he intended to give them their parole. He fumbled in his pocket of his chaps for what seemed an age, fighting the fog that wanted to blur his thoughts, fighting his own growing weakness. At last his fingers touched something, slipped away, came back, touched it again, grasped it, brought it out. A fat, green shotgun shell. Johnny slipped it into the eye hole at the bottom of the innie, and wasn't surprised to find it was a perfect fit. Its blunt circular top seated firmly against the anvil pellets. "You're primed, you bastard," he choked. "No," a voice whispered in his head. "No, you dare not." Johnny looked at the brass circlet, plugging the hole at the bottom of the innie. He gripped the handle of the hammer, his strength flagging badly now, and thought of what the cop had told him just before he stuck him in the back of "Sorry excuse for a writer," the cop had said. "You're a sorry excuse for a man, too." Johnny shoved the helmet off with the heel of his free left hand. He was laughing again as he raised the hammer high above his head, and laughing as he brought it down squarely on the base of the shell. God forgive me, I hate critics. He had one fraction of a moment to wonder if he had succeeded, and then the question was answered in the bloom of brilliant, soundless red. It was like swooning into a rose. Johnny Marinville let himself fall, and his last thoughts were of David. Had David gotten out? Had David gotten clear? Was he all right now? Would he be all right later? Excused early, Johnny thought. And then that was gone too. All right, we've got one chapter left. I'm going to actually read the last chapter here in a second. I'm going to stop this video, and then I'm going to continue on to the next one. Because this one's already an hour and a half, and it's probably going to be like another hour to read. So I don't want to make the video too long. So give me just a second, and I'll be right back for the last portion.